The evening began with a quiet tension that Emma Carter could not name, the kind that slips into a house before anyone notices, settling into corners and waiting to be discovered. And as she stood in the narrow hallway of her suburban Washington home, the air felt heavier than usual, filled with low voices and restrained laughter drifting from the living room where her husband Daniel and his friends had gathered after work, men he had known since college, men who filled the space easily while Emma often moved around them like a shadow, polite, kind, and mostly unseen, and as she walked toward the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, she heard her name spoken, not loudly, not carelessly, but with a tone that made her slow her steps, one of Daniel's friends saying that there was something about the way Emma played the piano at night, how it made the house feel different, alive somehow, and another agreeing, saying they liked to sit quietly and watch, not in a strange way, but in the way people watch a sunset or listen to a song that reaches somewhere deep. And when one of them said, half joking but half serious, that they hoped she would play again tonight because they just wanted to watch, Emma stopped completely, her hand resting against the wall as her heart beat faster, surprise mixing with confusion and a sharp awareness she had not felt in years, because no one had spoken about her like that before, not recently, not with that kind of attention. And as she stood there listening, she realized they were not talking about her body or her looks, not anything improper or crude, but about the way she became someone else when she sat at the piano, calmer, stronger, more present, and this realization stirred something inside her, a memory of who she used to be before marriage became routine and before she learned to make herself small to fit into quiet spaces. And the house around her suddenly felt too tight, as if the walls had been listening too, and when Daniel laughed softly and said Emma was just playing for herself, that she didn't even know anyone was listening, Emma felt a strange ache, because that was true. She never played for attention, she played because it was the only place she felt fully honest. And as the conversation shifted and the men began talking about work and sports, Emma moved again, slowly this time, her thoughts racing ahead of her steps, wondering when she had stopped being seen and how it felt both comforting and painful to realize that someone had noticed her again, even if it was only through a half-open door and a quiet melody. And as she reached the kitchen, she didn't turn on the light, choosing instead to stand in the dim glow from the living room, holding the glass of water she no longer wanted, her reflection faint in the window, older than she felt but younger than she feared, and she thought about the first years of her marriage, when Daniel used to sit beside her while she played, his hand resting on the bench, his eyes on her face, before long hours and shared responsibilities slowly pulled them apart without either of them noticing. And she wondered if Daniel even heard the music anymore or if it had become just another background sound in his life, and the thought made her chest tighten, because the idea that his friend saw something he no longer did felt unfair and sad in a way she couldn't easily explain. And as she stood there, she admitted something to herself that she had never said out loud, not even in her private thoughts, that a part of her wanted to be watched too, not out of vanity, but out of a deep human need to be recognized, to feel that her presence mattered, that her quiet efforts and unspoken emotions were not disappearing into the walls of her own home. And this wish frightened her because it felt selfish and disloyal, yet it also felt honest, and honesty had been missing from her life for a long time. And when she finally returned to the living room with the water she never drank, she smiled politely, exchanged a few kind words, and moved past them as usual. But inside her something had already changed, a small crack opening in the shell she had built around herself, letting in light and uncertainty at the same time. And later that night, when the house grew quiet and Daniel went to bed early, tired from the day, Emma sat alone at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys as she thought about the words she had overheard, about the idea of being watched not as an object but as a person with depth and feeling. And as she began to play, the music came faster than usual, flowing with urgency and emotion, filling the house with a sound that carried both longing and hope. And though she did not know it yet, this moment marked the beginning of something that would challenge her marriage, her sense of self, and the quiet life she had learned to accept. Because once a person realizes they have been unseen, they cannot easily return to the dark, and once they wish to be seen, even gently, the wish has a way of growing, waiting patiently for the right moment to be answered. Emma Carter had always lived quietly, her life a careful balance of kindness, routine, and quiet dreams tucked away in notebooks and piano sheets that rarely saw the light of day. And as she walked through the autumn leaves outside her Washington home, she thought about the life she had built around others, Daniel's career, his friends, his ambitions, while hers had remained soft, almost invisible, a gentle hum beneath the louder sounds of the world. And yet there was a spark inside her, a small flame she had kept alive through poetry, music, and moments when no one was watching, and lately, that spark had grown restless, nudged by the subtle recognition from Daniel's friends, who seemed to see something in her she had forgotten existed, and she felt a mixture of surprise, shame, and delight at their attention, because it was not about being admired superficially, but about being noticed as someone with depth, someone capable of emotion and artistry. And she remembered the first time she had truly felt seen, sitting at the piano in her parents' living room as a child, the notes floating into the air and someone simply listening without interruption, a feeling she had carried with her into adulthood but had rarely experienced in her marriage as the years passed, with routines, chores, and responsibilities creating distance between her and Daniel, and in the evenings, when she played quietly in the dim light of their home, she felt herself again, free in a way that no conversation or social gathering ever allowed, and as she considered the recent visits of Daniel's friends, who lingered just outside the doorway or in the living room, waiting for her to start playing, she realized they were not intruding or being rude, they were giving her the same gift she had always longed for, to be witnessed, to have her presence matter, to be appreciated without judgment, and this thought made her heart swell with a mix of excitement and nervousness, because she knew she had spent years shrinking, adjusting her desires to fit into the spaces others had made for her, and now there was proof that she could still be remarkable, still capable of evoking awe without changing herself, without pretending or performing for anyone, and Emma reflected on how strange it was that recognition could feel both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time, the fear of being misunderstood clashing with the desire to be known, to let someone past the surface and into the quiet chambers of her soul. And she thought about her friends at work, her neighbors, the people who passed through her life without ever really seeing her, and she felt a subtle sorrow, realizing that most of her interactions had been polite but hollow, functional but without true emotional depth, and yet, in the presence of Daniel's friends, she had glimpses of the attention she craved, attention rooted in respect, admiration, and a kind of silent encouragement that made her feel alive in ways she had not felt in years. And as she sat at the piano one late evening, the house empty except for the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the floorboards, she allowed herself to pour all of her longing, her quiet frustration, and her hopes into the music, her fingers moving with a speed and emotion that startled even her, the notes racing ahead of her thoughts as if they carried messages from the parts of herself she had neglected, and in that moment, she understood that this was not just a hobby or a pastime, it was the bridge back to herself, a bridge that could reconnect her to Daniel, to his friends, and to the part of life that thrived on genuine attention and shared emotion, and she remembered nights long ago when Daniel would sit beside her, his hand sometimes brushing against hers, silent but present, and she had forgotten that feeling, allowing routine and fatigue to dull the intimacy that had once been effortless, and now, as she played faster, more confidently, she sensed a shift not only in her own heart but in the energy around her, as though the house itself was leaning in to listen, carrying the vibrations of her music into the walls and into the ears of those who had come to appreciate her quietly, and in her mind, she replayed their small gestures, the way one friend's eyes would soften when a particular melody rose, the way another would tilt his head as if trying to memorize each note, the way Daniel's laugh had always returned in the quiet after a song ended, a sound she realized she had missed more than she had admitted. And these memories mingled with the present, fueling a sense of urgency, of needing to reclaim herself in the midst of a life that had often overlooked her needs, and she felt a mixture of joy, sorrow, and longing, a complex cocktail that made her heart pound, because she understood that recognition and attention were not trivial, but essential, that being noticed was a form of love, not necessarily romantic, but human, deep, and sustaining, and she realized that the curiosity and admiration of Daniel's friends were mirrors, reflecting back the part of her that had always been capable of beauty, resilience, and emotional depth, and as the evening drew on, the notes slowed, softening into gentle whispers, Emma felt both satisfaction and apprehension, knowing that the awareness of being seen could change everything, and she wondered whether Daniel would notice this shift, whether he would recognize the way her eyes sparkled as her fingers moved over the keys, whether he would understand that her longing for attention was not vanity but the simple desire to feel alive, to have her existence acknowledged, to be appreciated for her quiet brilliance. And in that moment, alone in the dimly lit room, Emma made a silent vow to herself. She would no longer hide, no longer play for the empty walls alone, but she would let the people who cared see her fully, and she would reclaim her presence in the lives of those she loved, starting with Daniel, starting with the friends who had given her the first glimpse of recognition in years. And as she rose from the piano bench, the echoes of the music lingering in the room, she felt a thrill of possibility, a pulse of hope that her life could shift, that her quiet existence could bloom into something noticed, cherished, and alive. And though the night was still, though the streets outside were silent, Emma knew that something had begun, something delicate, emotional, and profoundly human. A journey of being truly seen, of reclaiming herself, of awakening the heart she had kept tucked away. And she stepped into the hall, ready to embrace the attention, the connection, and the warmth that she had longed for, unaware of the gentle ripple her courage would create in the hearts of those around her, in her marriage, in her friendships, and most importantly, within herself. A quiet but unstoppable movement toward recognition, love, and emotional awakening. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem louder, and Emma Carter sat at the piano, her fingers tracing familiar keys while her mind raced with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to speak aloud, thinking about the way Daniel's friends had watched her play, the way their admiration had felt both strange and comforting. And just as she was lost in the music, she felt Daniel's presence behind her, the faint rustle of his movement, the sound of his breath shifting in the room, and she paused, unsure if she wanted to face him, yet curious, because something had changed between them, an invisible tension, an unspoken question lingering in the air. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady, he said, "You know they admire you." And Emma turned slightly, her hands resting on the keys, heart catching, unsure how to respond, because it was true, she had felt it, but hearing it confirmed made her pulse quicken with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. And Daniel continued, saying that they thought she was brave, that playing in front of others, even quietly, was a gift, and that they recognized the beauty and honesty she poured into every note. And Emma felt a lump in her throat, because no one had said such things to her in years, no one had acknowledged the part of her that longed to be noticed without fear, without judgment. And in that moment, sitting in the dim glow of the lamp, she realized that the admiration of friends was not enough, that she needed Daniel's recognition more than anyone else's. And when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed lately, a softness, a quiet regret, and a kind of longing that mirrored her own. And Daniel admitted, gently, almost hesitantly, that he had stopped noticing, that life had grown routine and that he had allowed himself to take her presence for granted. And Emma felt a wave of emotion, a mix of sadness and hope, because acknowledgement, even belated, could heal cracks that had formed over years. And as she listened to him speak, she realized how much they had both missed, how many silent moments had passed without true connection, without seeing each other fully. And she thought about all the evenings she had played alone, the music filling empty spaces while her heart wished to be understood. And now Daniel was there, finally watching, truly seeing her, not with judgment or expectation, but with the quiet vulnerability of someone who cared deeply. And Emma's fingers began moving over the keys again, softly this time, letting the music speak what words could not, letting it carry the emotions of longing, regret, and love that had been held back for too long. And Daniel leaned closer, listening, his hand brushing lightly against hers, a small gesture but one that bridged years of distance and misunderstanding. And for the first time in a long while, Emma felt fully present, fully alive, knowing that connection was possible, knowing that recognition was not just external but shared, reciprocal, and necessary. And as the song ended, the notes lingering in the air like a breath held too long, they sat together in silence, both of them aware of the delicate balance that had shifted in that quiet room, a balance of honesty, vulnerability, and emotion. And Emma realized that being seen was not a fleeting desire but a need, a human craving for acknowledgement and intimacy. And Daniel's presence, his quiet admission, and his gentle listening were enough to begin rebuilding the bridge between them, a bridge that had been neglected but never destroyed. And as they sat together, the weight of unspoken words filling the room yet feeling lighter than ever, Emma understood that this was a turning point, that the fragile beauty of their renewed connection could grow if nurtured, and that recognition and appreciation were acts of love as meaningful as any spoken promise. And when Daniel finally smiled, a real, soft smile that reached his eyes, Emma felt tears threatening, not of sadness but of release, because she had been seen, truly seen, and her heart, which had longed for this simple acknowledgement, felt lighter, freer, ready to embrace the intimacy that had been dormant. And in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the echoes of music and the soft glow of lamplight, Emma knew that the hardest step had been taken, admitting her own need to be noticed, hearing it reflected in someone she loved, and allowing herself to feel worthy of that attention. And as the evening stretched on, they talked softly about small things at first, then memories, then dreams, each word building trust, understanding, and closeness. And Emma realized that sometimes connection is less about grand gestures and more about the courage to share your presence and the willingness of someone else to receive it, to watch without judgment, to listen without distraction. And as the night deepened, she felt a sense of quiet triumph, a reassurance that love, attention, and recognition were not lost to time or routine, that they could be reclaimed, nurtured, and shared. And though the road ahead would require patience, honesty, and vulnerability, Emma felt ready, more alive than she had in years, knowing that the music she played was not just notes on a page but a language of the heart, a way to communicate longing, regret, hope, and love, and that Daniel was finally listening, truly watching. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that the quiet, tender reconnection they had begun that night could grow into something enduring, emotional, and profoundly human, something that would strengthen their marriage, deepen their bond, and allow both of them to be fully seen, fully understood, and fully cherished. Weeks passed, and Emma Carter felt a subtle but undeniable shift in the rhythm of her life, a movement that began the night Daniel admitted he had stopped truly noticing her. And now that acknowledgement had grown into a gentle, persistent presence in their marriage, a sense that her existence mattered in a way it had not for years. And one evening, the small community center announced a gathering, a casual event where locals could share art, music, and stories. And Emma, encouraged by Daniel and the quiet support of his friends, decided to play, not for an audience, not for praise, but to step fully into the life she had been rediscovering. And as she arrived, the room was alive with conversation, soft laughter, and the shuffling of chairs, neighbors exchanging greetings, children running briefly past the stage, and familiar faces that made her feel both nervous and excited. And when she saw Daniel sitting in the front row, his posture attentive, his eyes following her every movement with warmth and pride, she felt a surge of reassurance. And the sight of his friends near the back, watching quietly but with soft smiles, reminded her of the first evening she had overheard their admiration, making her heart race with a mixture of anticipation and calm confidence. And as she approached the piano, her hands brushing lightly over the polished surface, she felt the familiar thrill of connection, the electricity of being truly seen. And as the first notes escaped under her fingers, the room seemed to hush, the chatter fading into a gentle silence, the music taking hold of every corner, weaving a delicate thread that drew everyone in. And she played faster at first, letting the emotion of longing, hope, and quiet excitement pour out of her, the melodies carrying fragments of her heart into the space, making each listener aware of the depth she had carried silently for so long. And Emma noticed subtle reactions, Daniel leaning slightly forward, his hand resting loosely on his knee, his eyes glistening with recognition, a neighbor whispering to another, their eyes wide with quiet awe, the friends at the back swaying gently to the rhythm, their expressions soft, attentive, and proud. And Emma realized that she was no longer playing for herself alone, nor was she playing for validation, but for a shared human experience, a connection that transcended words and simple observation. And as she continued, her hands danced over the keys with more confidence, more freedom, allowing the music to carry her past nerves and self-consciousness into a space of pure expression, each chord resonating with the honesty she had longed to share. And as the final notes lingered, the room stayed still for a heartbeat, suspended between the echo of the last sound and the collective breath of those who had listened. And then applause came, gentle but heartfelt, spreading through the room like warmth, affirming not only her skill but the courage it had taken to step into the light, to let herself be seen without fear or hesitation. And Emma looked at Daniel, their eyes locking, and in that glance, she felt the years of distance, routine, and silence dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady recognition that they were once again connected, not superficially, but deeply, in a way that could sustain them. And as she lowered her hands, a mix of relief, joy, and vulnerability washed over her, knowing that this small act of playing music in a room full of people had become a turning point. A declaration that she existed fully, that her heart, her presence, and her emotions mattered, and that being watched, when it was done with respect, admiration, and love, was not a threat or a demand but a form of acceptance and connection that nourished the soul. And as the evening wore on, conversations flowed more naturally, Daniel's friends chatting with her about the music, Daniel himself expressing quiet pride, neighbors complimenting not just her skill but the emotion she had conveyed. And Emma felt a sense of belonging she had not realized she craved, a warmth that was subtle but profoundly moving. And as they walked home together that night, the streets quiet under the glow of streetlights, she felt a new kind of closeness with Daniel, an understanding that had taken months of small moments, honesty, and courage to cultivate, and she reflected on the journey that had led her here, from overhearing admiration in a living room, to reclaiming her own presence at the piano, to being fully witnessed and valued. And she realized that life had shifted not through grand gestures but through persistent attention, gentle acknowledgement, and the courage to let oneself be known. And in that understanding, she felt hope bloom, a quiet confidence that the bond she shared with Daniel, strengthened by mutual recognition and emotional honesty, could endure, deepen, and grow. And as they reached their doorstep, Emma glanced back at the night sky, the stars faint but steady, and she understood that being seen was more than a fleeting wish, more than applause or attention. It was about connection, about love in its simplest, most human form, about the courage to let someone witness your true self. And she felt that courage solidify within her, knowing that she had stepped into her own life, her own story, and that she would carry this awareness forward, into music, marriage, friendships, and the small, tender moments that define a life well lived. And in that moment, the quiet triumph of being truly seen, recognized, and valued settled around her like a gentle embrace, a reassurance that the human heart, when allowed to shine, could touch others, transform relationships, and bring a depth of meaning that made every note, every glance, every shared silence profoundly beautiful. And as Daniel slipped his hand into hers, Emma knew that this was not just the end of an evening but the beginning of a deeper, more emotionally rich chapter of their lives, a chapter built on mutual attention, love, understanding, and the simple but powerful act of witnessing each other fully, tenderly, and with genuine care.